I think the best way to start is to consider why we're pursuing this problem. What is the riddle or puzzle that has brought us to this table? And with your help, we'll pursue further. If I can have an attempt to define what I think the riddle is, and then any of you, as we move round, can modify it, say, no, that isn't the riddle, or I've got another riddle, or whatever. But if I have a first go and explain what it is that interests me about modernity, and it's best explained really using this sand clock. We are really, in the year 1999 or 2000, right down here at the bottom. We live in an extraordinary world which we take for granted. It's a world which is filled with a certain amount of liberty and democratic politics. It's a world which is fairly egalitarian for some people. The relations between men and women and so on is, in some senses, improving. It's a world which has scientific knowledge on a large scale. It's a world which has very sophisticated technologies. And we tend to take all this for granted, certainly in the advanced industrial world. And yet, the moment you look at the whole of history, you realize what an extraordinary thing this is, and what a recent thing it is. If you go back a bit, you discover that all this is really the product, or a lot of it seems to be the product of the last 200 or 300 years. And what is even more extraordinary, and the riddle that interests me, is that much of it seems to have flowed through a very narrow gateway, or over a narrow bridge, through a particular place, which is England. Much of what the world now is has flowed through England. Now that doesn't mean that it was actually created in England, but much of it, the language, the law, the industrial processes, the political systems, went through this island some 300 or 400 years or less ago. And the riddle is, firstly, why much of what we know around us went through this particular place at that particular time. And in order to solve that riddle, since this is only the middling point, so to speak, one has to go back and try and see what it was that flowed through that point. And this great bubble, which is now empty, is the past, thousands of years of human history, which flowed through there and has ended up as we are now. So the riddle is firstly to go back to a point in time where modern civilization seems to have started, and then to see what all the currents and tides and sand that flowed through that was. So that's my riddle, how we got here in this extraordinary world. The first and most difficult thing is to realize that it's a puzzle at all. We take it for granted. It's the air we breathe. Surely we've always been like that. But if you look at the long history of man, it's just a tiny speck of time since we suddenly seem to have burst the bounds out of an agrarian, agricultural world into an industrial, scientific, and modern political world. So that's my riddle. Simon?
No, I think that's right. I mean, there's an even more interesting version of the riddle, which is, if to use your sand clock analogy, which is the sand clock works because of gravity. And I guess the equivalent in history is destiny. For quite a long time, and certainly for quite a long time since the 18th century and since Britain's role in the 18th century change, the fact that, as you say, everything seemed to come from a particular British conjuncture in the 18th and early 19th century was itself seen as inevitable. So that you only needed destiny to explain the process by which this nation and these processes had been selected, and why they then got diffused across the planet. So in that sense, what's new for us is to see it as a riddle. In other words, a process that needs explanation. Because many previous generations would have said, well, it's self-evident. Not just that these things have always been with us, But even if one noticed that they hadn't always been with us, that they were achievements of a particular culture at a particular time in the past, it then didn't seem to need an explanation either, because this was manifest destiny, this was fate, this was the civilizing mission of the West, a whole series of racist ideas about the triumph of Europe or the triumph of the West came from this assumption. And by giving up on destiny, to use your analogy, by giving up on gravity, the riddle gets much more interesting. Because we're not only talking about the uniqueness at the waist of the hourglass, but also the kinds of processes which change people's lives in a real sense at all. And I think that's absolutely up for grabs. So for me, the riddle is, what kinds of features of everyday life count as explanations of such a dramatic set of changes in human experience?
Yes, that is going to be, because if it isn't destiny or God or the superiority of the white races or something, then what is it?
I have to say, I think this particular piece of technology you've got there
we should give it up?
Is constraining our thoughts. Yes, for a start. No, let it rest there for a minute, but well, turn it over by all means and let history reverse itself. For a start, once your sand has got to the bottom, it doesn't go anywhere else. That rather suggests that we have already got wherever we ought to get to, and that job's done. There's just the past, which flows uniquely through, can we call it the English bottleneck there?
That's right.
Everything has to get through. Whereas, as somebody who's interested in the history of science and technology in China and East Asia generally, I'd like to build a much more complex piece of apparatus. For a start, it will have various other holes at the bottom because there's a future ahead of us. And where is it going? It's certainly not going to stay in England. Well, it hasn't stayed in England.
No.
Where's America in that? And secondly, there'll be several different bulbs in different places, through some of which the sand falls perhaps into a dead end. But a lot of the sand will end up being the sand that eventually flows through England. So I think we'll find ourselves perhaps with perhaps not just one riddle, perhaps quite a few riddles, at the very least, if we take a world perspective on it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The upper bulb was meant to represent the whole of the world. At the beginning, the whole of human beings, then gradually narrowing down through civilizations which passed on the sand to a certain place, but it is already becoming constraining. There is a world around us which can't be, we don't anyway, believe that it was caused by some destiny or providence which has made this world. You then have the historical problem of explaining it. Now, I was brought up really to believe that the way you explain things in history was to start at the beginning and to work forward and say, you know, it began there and then you had this and then you had this and then you had that. And this, I think, was one of the reasons why one did have a sense of destiny and that things were working out towards an end, because you had decided this was the end point and this was the beginning point, and you showed how it was inevitable that it would end up like that. All the things that didn't happen were forgotten because you didn't consider those. So you had a chain leading from a beginning to an end. Now, more and more, as one no longer believes in destiny, one has to have a new methodology for looking at the past. And I've been impressed by looking at the methodology that is used by biologists and detectives like Sherlock Holmes. What they do is they start with an event like the modern world. They say, this is the outcome, this is the crime, this is the strange thing that has happened. Edgar Allan Poe's detectives did the same thing. Detective did the same thing. Here is the event to be explained. Here is evolution as we see it around us. How are you going to explain it? And what they used was a method where you went back along a chain of causes, seeing how you got to where you are, choosing, and often these chains were very complicated and long, and they often went in all sorts of directions. So you had multitudinous chains leading up to the final event that you saw now. So this analytic method, going backwards from the final result to a possible set of hundreds of causes, all interlinked, is the one that I have found useful myself in my recent work. I don't know, what do you think of that as a way of approaching our problem? Christopher, do you use this, or do you work forwards?
Well, one of the problems about asking questions like how something came to happen is that it tends to involve you sooner or later having to explain why other things didn't happen. Once, for instance, why did the Industrial Revolution, as we choose to define it, happen in this country and not in East Asia? I don't mind describing what happened here during the Industrial Revolution and taking it to pieces and seeing how the wheels worked, if you want to use a mechanical analogy, or how the various sort of species involved in the industrial and business world of Britain in the 19th century competed. If you want to use a biological analogy, that's fine, understanding something that actually did happen. But what worries me is when we start to try to find something elsewhere in the world, as in China, for instance, and say, well, why didn't the same thing happen there? And if we're going to try to explain why the dog didn't bark in the night, that may be the most interesting question that presents itself to us, like Sherlock Holmes, but it leads us into some rather difficult pathways of thought that I don't feel I know the way through at all.
It is very, very difficult. Negative cases, what didn't happen, and explaining what didn't happen, but I'm afraid that's probably what we're going to be spending some of our time on.
I certainly think it's important for people, for folk who are interested in history and telling historical stories to each other, to face up to the fact that, as Chris just said, most historical narratives that make sense and are appealing to us always involve what logicians call counterfactuals. Inevitably,
and the counterfactual
they do. That is to say, they always involve playing little games by imagining how
suppose the
things
rocket
might
had exploded,
by
and everyone
imagining
said,
how things could have turned out differently. I mean, the game that Sherlock Holmes constantly plays with the unfortunate Dr. Watson is exactly that game. You know, when you've ruled out the impossible, what's left, however improbable, must be what happened, and that's a trick. I mean, logically, there are some problems about moving straight from the red earth on the instep of his visitor to the fact that this man must have fought in the Afghan war. But the narrative carries us over those problems, and it does so by inviting us to imagine what else might have happened, or what if things had turned out slightly differently. Now, one of the things about pulling focus and taking a much more global perspective than simply focusing, in this case, on the British experience in the 18th century, so changing the space to planet-wide phenomena and to thousands of years, is that it gives us lots of stories to think about. It gives us really lived sequences of events which are going to simultaneously illustrate but also test any explanation that we might want to come up with for what happened there and then. I don't see an alternative to that. So I mean, what I'm saying is I certainly don't see an alternative to the comparative approach. There's another aspect to the comparative approach which I think has got a lot going for it, which is a kind of almost ethical or moral point of view. If you think that where society has ended up at the end of the 20th century is not only inevitable but pretty good, that's going to select out the kinds of stories you're going to come up with to explain how we got here. So that, again, folk commenting on what's happening in early 19th century Britain, who make the assumption, not all of them do, but those who make the assumption that this is virtuous, what's happening, are therefore going to be choosing certain kinds of explanations and exclude others. But once one comes to take a slightly more gloomy, not quite so celebratory view of what's happened, let's say, between the middle of the 18th and the late 20th centuries, a whole new set of things you need to think about if you want to explain what happened come into play. You need to look beyond Britain's shores, beyond Europe, beyond the Northern Hemisphere. You need to look at ranges of factors that you might not otherwise have thought of, like shopping, as well as making stuff, like science and technology as well as religion, like the geography of Europe in comparison to the geography of Eastern Asia. All sorts of things which turn out, I think, to matter quite a lot are invisible if you take a particularly very focused, very tight view of what it is that you're actually trying to explain here. So I think the analytical method, that is to say, following the detectives around, has got a lot going for it, especially because it makes you think comparatively. How could things have been otherwise? What is happening elsewhere? Is this the only outcome? And I think that's the right way to go for us.
But basically, surely all you're saying is that all our assumptions are influenced by our politics and our ethics. And whether you're going to take a positive or a more negative view of Britain's progress, it's just going to very much go back to those basic political positions. And how are you going to avoid that? I mean, it's the old problem of what is the moral basis, the political basis of our historical explanations?
Sure. I mean, there's a difference between knowing that they exist and not knowing that they exist.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true. That's a big deal.
Being aware of it, yes.
Being aware of it. I think that moral point that you made about the comparison is something that we ought to emphasize at the beginning. There is a danger in any global sweep through history that you end up saying the present is virtuous, the past is less virtuous, or we are virtuous and the others aren't. And I think we ought to emphasize that a great deal about the present world is not at all virtuous, and our civilization is in no way superior to any other, and that is one of the things you learn if you study comparative history and go over long time sweeps. But
I think one thing Sherlock Holmes' method has got going for it, which we haven't touched on yet, is that detectives like things.
they like objects.
Yeah. And there's a really interesting question there about when did it come to pass that folk thought that things are evidence, as opposed to what people say or what they write or what you can make them say on oath. I'm an historian of science. I try to learn as much as I possibly can simply by taking an object and treating it as evidence, trying to find out from the existence, way of working, way of handling that device, object, product, commodity, thing, what it can tell us about the world that made it possible for this to exist, and the world that using this object summoned into existence. And their methods of detection are really important, partly because they were invented precisely to deal with those questions. What can we learn from these kinds of objects, artifacts, devices, and how can we work out what effects they must have had? So I find kind of dealing with the material stuff of culture can often be surprisingly eloquent, because one has something palpable to deal with, and because my view would be social life is often organized around these things, and it tells us about how they were made and what they were used for. So there, I think, the analytical method, doing what detectives do, actually pays rich dividends, because it makes you ask the right kinds of questions about the right kinds of things.
I'd like to say something about this analogy of the detective story and the way in which we can talk about evidence in the Sherlock Holmes sense. And yes, indeed, this, of course, is a producer of evidence as well as a piece of evidence itself, isn't it? And here I am looking at a thing there, and I'm Sherlock Holmes, and it tells me something. Now, the thing about the Sherlock Holmes story is that it always has a certain kind of denouement, usually in which a human being, very often, actually says, yes, you're right, I did it, Mr. Holmes, and I'm proud that I killed him, and so on. So there's a confession, or else somebody is convicted by the courts, which is, in British justice, just as good as a confession, as we all know. The problem is about history. History keeps its mouth shut. It won't confess to us. It won't say to us, you've got it, you've got me banged to rights. And so our detective analogy is always going to be a little faulty here, isn't it?
Three things to stress. The first thing is that there are no solutions. We're not here gathered around to find answers. We're here to pursue puzzles and clues and to help people in the search for answers, but we're not going to certainly not provide them. The second point is that many of our clues will lie in objects, in the making of objects, in the using of objects, in what people thought about the objects, and that's a very good way to pursue history. The third thing to stress is that there are two, as I see it, two great riddles. One is that there have been two civilizations on this earth in the last 8,000 or 9,000 years. One lasted for the first almost all the time, and that was an agricultural civilization like this, which is agraria, the past. Only in the last 200 years has something entirely new happened on this globe, which is an industrial civilization. And the great riddle is how and why the first is now giving way to the second. The sub-puzzle, which is a smaller one, is why it happened first in one country, in England and Britain, rather than elsewhere. So that's a sub-riddle to the major riddle.